Design might actually be kind of an easy choice here because the iPhone 6s Plus actually has a lot of the same design cues and tropes from the previous generation. Even the button layout and pretty much everything is in the same place, and even with the 3D touch, which we'll touch upon a little bit later, everything looks and feels largely the same. The rounded sides and corners with this metal unibody actually make for kind of a slippery design, but ultimately the handling is what you would expect from a larger form factor here. And that is essentially the same that you would get in the Nexus 6P, but the design is very new for the Nexus line this time around. What you have is Huawei at the helm, and they have put flat sides around this 5.7-inch screen that help with the handling because you can get a pretty good grip on there, but it's still not ideal. Neither of these devices are for one-handed usage. That black bar on the top covers up the camera and its accessories, and below it is the fingerprint reader and of course the Nexus logo in landscape. Now that fingerprint reader is a big focus in this time around, and we'll also get to that a little bit later in the hardware section. But ultimately both of these devices really use metal as their main cue for premium, and in the Nexus 6P, P stands for premium, and that's something that you've already expected from Apple iPhones up until now. So really you can take your pick, but you're going to get a very high quality device either way. The display is more of a spec battle here because you get two very different resolutions and even constructions in these displays. The IPS display of the iPhone 6s Plus comes in at full HD resolution and has a 5.5-inch size. So really it's good for media and games and even text viewing for the most part, even though its text might not be quite as sharp as the Quad HD display here on the Nexus 6P, which has 2560 by 1440 resolution in this 5.7-inch display. Now this is also of an AMOLED construction, which means that the deeper blacks provide better contrast, and actually the colors are punched out a little bit more. So really, in our opinion, the Nexus 6P does have a slightly better viewing experience, especially because of those colors, but even then you can even get more out of this display because the higher pixel density makes text incredibly sharp. We do think that you'll have a good time in either of these displays, as Quad HD and 1080p aren't too far off the mark for daily usage, but if you are spec hungry, the Nexus 6P is obviously going to be your choice. Performance is a little bit more neck and neck, however, because you're looking at two different ecosystems that provide and demand different things from their processors. The Nexus 6P uses the Snapdragon 810 with Adreno graphics and 3GB of RAM, all of which are the de facto processing package for Android, and it does a great job of letting the optimized and stock Android Marshmallow really fly. We are able to get through all applications and elements of Marshmallow, and even gaming has been really a treat. But the same can be said for the iPhone as well, which uses what might seem like an underpowered when compared to Android, Apple A9, which is a dual-core processor backed by PowerVR graphics and 2GB of RAM. Now, while that might be an upgrade from before, it still sounds a little paltry when compared to very powerful Android handsets, but because of iOS and its own optimizations, it's still able to really go by swimmingly. No matter what we were able to do on the iPhone 6s Plus, we had a good time on it, even when it came to gaming as well. Hardware is actually kind of an even playing field because with the iPhone 6s Plus, you had to contend already, many Apple users did, with the lack of extra features like the removable batteries and expandable storage, but that's also the case with the Nexus devices. But the main trope here is the fingerprint reader, which everyone is talking about, especially with Nexus Imprint in Android Marshmallow. You basically just have to have your finger on this back area here, and you'll be able to unlock and wake the device at the same time. But on the iPhone 6s Plus, they have been able to update the fingerprint reader embedded in the home button, so you don't really have to leave your thumb lying on the button. You just have to press it, and because it's pretty much always firing, you'll be able to get in just fine. When it comes to the more conventional offerings, however, you do have the front-facing speakers, dual stereo speakers on the Nexus 6P, which provide great sound and a lot of body in that dual setup. But we will say that there is some richness to the bottom-mounted speaker of the iPhone 6s Plus still, but it definitely doesn't get quite as loud. Now, what the iPhone 6s Plus is definitely able to boast is a new layer of sensors underneath the screen that allow for 3D touch. It's able to really tell just how hard you're pressing on the screen, and if you press hard enough on icons or certain areas of the OS, you will be able to trigger even more things to happen, like shortcuts into applications that otherwise you would have to open it and then swipe and press around in order to get to. It's a nice new layer to the inputs of iOS, which has otherwise been a pretty formulaic experience for the last few years. And finally, in battery, the main story here, for us at least, is that the iPhone 6s Plus does not have fast charging. Now, the battery of the iPhone 6s Plus is able to go for a pretty good time, at least a full day, but its standby time is something that we will definitely highlight. But standby time is a focus of Android Marshmallow, as Doze is now added in. Doze allows for the phone to really have a good standby time as long as its sensors are not being triggered. You have to leave it face down or face up, and you pretty much just have to not touch it, but the standby time can be pretty great. But the 3450 mAh battery in the Nexus 6P goes for quite a long time. Even with somewhat moderate usage, we've been able to go for about a couple of days without really needing to charge the phone. But with fast charging using the USB Type-C standard now, we have been able to get some great battery life on here by just plugging it in for a little while in the middle of the day. 0 to 100 can be charged in about 90 minutes, which is awesome and makes fast charging one of those indispensable tools for Android. When it comes to the cameras, we are actually looking at two similarly spec'd camera packages here, with the 12 megapixel iPhone 6s Plus camera coming with optical image stabilization, which should help it in lower light situations. Google tried to battle this, however, with a larger sensor in the Nexus 6P that comes with 13 megapixels, and thus the larger sensor should be able to bring in some better light. But when it comes to the applications, we really didn't see too many differences here, as both are pretty much automatic point and shoot applications. You do get some extra modes in both of them, including panorama, photosphere, and lens blur for the Nexus, and then the iPhone has time-lapse, hyperlapse, and a couple of other modes, but ultimately, aside from changing HDR to auto or off or anything like that, you kind of have a point-and-shoot experience for both of these cameras. When it came to camera quality, however, usually it's a bit of a toss-up, but with the Nexus line we have a massive improvement in what used to be a lackluster experience. The iPhones have always been known to have some pretty good camera optics, and in this case the quality is still a little bit better in the low light situations due to the OIS, but the larger sensor of the Nexus 6P is not all that shabby either. But in brighter situations, the Nexus actually punches out the colors just a little bit more, so if that's more enjoyable for you, then you're probably going to be picking the Android phone. But when it comes to detail and clarity, both of these cameras do very well. It just matters which of the color profiles look a little bit better to you. As far as social media and maybe even some production go, you can use either of these cameras for a daily companion when it comes to shooting your memories. And finally, in software, we have Android versus iOS, the age-old comparison that actually is a little bit easier to make now. iOS has been pretty formulaic, and you can pretty much expect the same experience here. You do have the home screens with all the icons and some extra information and controls if you swipe from the bottom or the top or even to the side, depending on what it is that you need, like the control center coming up from the bottom. But iOS has added in the 3D touch, which is a big layer that is added on top of what has been a pretty familiar experience in iOS. It adds a layer of input that users can take advantage of, and we're excited to see where it does go in the future. But ultimately, iOS is eye candy for the Apple users, and everyone is pretty happy with it generally when they get their iPhones. But now Android has really come a long way, and Marshmallow brings some refinements to its own formula. It still has the same tropes as well, with Google Now over on the side in the Google Now launcher, and the home screens can be riddled with widgets because you have all of your applications inside of the app drawer, which is now a vertical scroll. But from there, you still get the notification drop down with the quick settings, and the additions that Marshmallow puts in aren't necessarily flashy, but they're ultimately very useful, like app permissions. App permissions do allow the user to have a better insight into what applications are trying to access in the phone. And after that, Now on Tap provides an easy way of searching what is already on the screen, and when it works pretty well. Ultimately, the experiences for both of these phones is pretty similar now because the app gap is not necessarily that big anymore. You can pretty much get the same experience no matter which one you pick. So it just matters what you want to have wrapped around your overall app experience, and that will probably be the one that you want to pick between these two. This time around, you're going to be paying $749 total to T-Mobile in monthly payments in order to get the 16GB version. But if you want to bump up to 64, you have to put down another $100. On the other hand, the Nexus 6P is generally considered just an unlocked device and is not available for monthly payments on carriers. And for the Nexus 6P, it starts off at the 32GB model for $499. $50 extra will get you the 64GB model, and we do think that you should get that one just to have a little bit more space in your phone. And so there you have it for the Nexus 6P and the iPhone 6s Plus, the two purest and biggest actually experiences you can get for both of these respective ecosystems. In the case of the iPhone 6s Plus, it is a refining of a formula that we are already pretty familiar with by now, but the addition of 3D Touch does allow it to provide a feature that we're kind of excited to see where it goes in the future. But really, it's the Nexus 6P that has closed the gap between its Android brethren and the iPhones, mostly because now that we have a Google-centric phone with stock Android on here that is able to provide power and camera quality that is on par with the iPhones, we do think that it deserves a lot of credit. In order to get the purest example of what Android should be, the Nexus is definitely where you should go, and the more premium of the two is one of the best phones we've seen this year. If you want a large phone for large experiences, then of course you're going to pick one of these two. But if you are already a purist for either of these ecosystems, then you know which one you're going to pick. But at least we know that no matter which side of the fence you pick, the grass is definitely going to be very green.